I would also like to join the other panelists here in thanking the organization. Thanks for having me here at this really crucial meeting, I would say, and I've already learned a lot. What I think I would like to do as part of my presentation is really seek to theorize some of the discussions that we have about identity. What do we mean when we're talking about migrant youth identities? But also try to show some examples, really from a bottom-up perspective, starting really or taking digital and social media practices as an entry point. So showing really how identity or actually identification works online by looking at what migrant youth put up themselves about themselves, so what they would like to show of themselves. So if we have critiqued this top-down labeling of migrants and pigeonholing of migrants, so what happens if we look at what migrant young people actually put up themselves online? So that's really part of my research agenda for the past 7 years or so. So I've worked with ethnic minorities in the Netherlands, with young Londoners of diverse backgrounds, and now in a project working with young people of refugee background, as well as young people from expatriate families in the Netherlands. So really, my interest in studying media and internet and migration came from personal experience. I had this ambition or dream, perhaps, growing up to become a basketball player. And I lived actually pretty close to a local asylum seeker center. And I found out, or me and my friends found out, that there actually were a lot of really excellent basketball players living in the center. So we spent a lot of our times at this local center. And having studied media and communication over the past 15 years ago or so, I realized that actually we should rethink migrants really as early adopters of technologies. Because thinking back then, these were the early 90s when I visited this local asylum seeker center. And many young people living in the center had set up an email address, had already access to mobile phones. Well, me, myself, and my white classmates in my local school, we didn't have mobile phones yet, and we were just starting to sign up to email accounts, for example. But I think still we see some of the stereotypes as migrants as being somehow culturally backward or backward in time or somehow unfit to handle Western advanced technologies. That really says much more about how we see technologies than how actually migrant young people are using technologies. Because it's not really a luxury good at all, it's actually a basic necessity. For example, to navigate one's journey across Europe, but also to stay in touch with loved ones abroad and also to connect with local authorities, for example. So I'm coming at this talk really from a media and communication and cultural studies perspective, but I would like to say and draw some connections to the field of human rights, particularly taking into account digital practices of migrant youth as human right claims, as actually claiming the right. So claiming the right to maintain family relations online, claiming the right to one's identity online. And also, so in line with some of the legislation that's been put forward, for example, in the CRC in Articles 8.1 on the right to preservation of identity, but also in 13.1 on the right of freedom of expression, regardless of frontiers and through any of the media of a child's choice. Now, what's interesting is that in recent years, legislating bodies have been grappling or at least considering human rights also from the perspective of digital media. And I think this is really an urgent way to move forward, especially if we want to consider actually everyday practices which are increasingly digitally mediated. So, for example, the work by Ethan and Rupert on digital right claims presents us with an interesting entry point. So to consider, for example, the refugee taking selfies upon arrival of the European shores in Greece can be seen as human right claims. Or maintaining transnational connections using Skype can be seen as actually human right claims to maintain family relations, for example, across borders. If we then further seek to theorize this in literature and within the media and internet studies landscape, but also in general journalistic accounts and media depictions of migration in relation to media, it's interesting that in a lot of media depictions and scholarship on migrants, there is this differentiation. In studies focusing on young people growing up in expatriate families, there's often this assumption that these young people automatically and naturally develop a sense of third capital, being able to navigate between their parents' culture, a local culture, but also as a way of preparing for the global knowledge economy. And key terms that are used in this kind of field are multiplicity, cosmopolitanism, participation in public sphere. Well, in studies on, for example, guest laborers, refugees, and post-socialist migrants, the focus is very often only on transnational connectivity. The focus is on the satellite dish as a kind of symbol of failure of integration, or the focus is on the refugees who is taking a selfie and sending it back to Syria as an example of perhaps isolation, or perhaps as a way of continuing only one's ethnic heritage. I think we should shift the frame in addressing migrant digital practices as always relational, so both turning towards one's own ethnic group, but also similarly and simultaneously also trying to address new connections. And I want to just give some examples of how this is actually happening if we look at what young people are actually doing. So this is an example of a friendship network maintained by Xavier, a 13-year-old London boy, born Portuguese boy, and this is a visualization of his Facebook friendship network. And during my interview with Xavier, we made this visualization, and the clusters, so the different colors that show up, are an indication of sameness. And we studied together what this sameness was. So we found out that actually a part of his network, so maybe 15 to 20%, which is common for most migrants, young people and their use of digital media, are people from the Portuguese diaspora. So Portuguese people living in London, and then Portuguese people living in Portugal. So the remainder, are about 80%, and this is common for most young people, are people living locally. So young people of various backgrounds, for example. So if we conceptualize this furthermore in some of the cultural studies literature, which hasn't been really used now to consider migrant identification over the last couple of years, but it's really an important framework to consider that migrant youth identities are actually not stable, are not fixed, are not essentialized. So it's impossible to pigeonhole our own identities, let alone identities of young people. So if we're studying and thinking about migrant youth identities, we should both take into account continuity, so develop in line with one's cultural heritage, for example, as one people, but also constant transformation. And this Instagram post of Jay, a 22-year-old young man from Syria, is already indicative. So he posts both a Dutch flag, living in the Netherlands and growing up in Haarlem, a city in the West, as well as his love for Syria. And then if we look at what he posts, what kind of images he posts, you see that he tries to claim a kind of ethnic or a kind of reevaluation of his ethnic heritage. And so being proud of Syria, so he uses the hashtag I love Syria while putting up this image of Syria. Welcome to Syria, no internet, no phones, no flights, no water, no electricity, no gas, no petrol, no heating, no medicines, no food. But then when we discuss this image and why he put it up, it's because he wants to criticize that most people upon arrival in the Netherlands assume that Syria is a country without any history, that actually it's a country where these things didn't exist. But he wants to use this image to show and critique the stereotype because actually before the Civil War started, these were things that were shaping his everyday life. So in his everyday life, he was connected. He was going to conservatory. He was using a mobile phone. So these kind of posts help us to rethink migrant youth identities really from the bottom up. As another final example that I want to show and to make us rethink or actually blow up the category of migrant identification are these icons that Media, a 13-year-old girl born in the Netherlands to parents who migrated from Morocco, put up on our profile page. So these are icons, groups that she liked on her social media platform, on the social media platform Hives, which existed prior to Facebook overtook it in 2011 in terms of popularity. But if we look at what she joined on her profile page, it's indicative for how migrant youth try to balance different affiliations and belongings. So what we can see on this page are, for example, from the top left onwards, is hijab style. A group called Respect is what I ask for the headscarf that I'm wearing. Moroccans with brains, then Moroccan girl page. Then a statement, show that you're choosing for freedom. The statement, I love Holland. Another statement, I love skinny jeans, and then an affiliation with fashion. So both global fashion with H&M, but also Moroccan dresses. And she also wanted to emphasize her love for Moroccan tea. But also the feminist claim that women are in charge. So it's interesting, if we think about migrant youth, we very often do not really conceptualize this as a complex identity, as it's very often conceived as somehow stuck. Upon the moment of migration, their identity is fixed, but actually we should reconsider this and think about the dynamism and changes. Then a final thing that then I'm really closing off, is that I want to highlight indeed this relationality in between, thinking, for example, about Syrians. So these are two Facebook groups set up by Syrians in the Netherlands as a way of negotiating the situation of information precarity. Because what we learn from talking to migrant young people is that the main difficulties they see, in their own words, in facing integration in the Netherlands is a situation of information precarity. For them, it's so unclear how to navigate all the official rules. Where should I who can I be in touch with to arrange for education, for example? And a lot of time their life is really stuck on hold because of their lack of access to information. So these pages are being described as some sort of trip advisor for refugees, and they're actually essential because there people share their everyday experiences in kind of making living in the Netherlands happen. So I would like to thank you very much for your attention. Thanks.